The story took place in a small village in Hunan Province, China. In the village, Xiao and Li were a young couple who grew up together and had a very good relationship, but their parents didn't approve of their relationship. The two young people didn't want to be separated, but no matter how hard they tried to persuade their families, the parents on both sides disagreed and the two were forced to separate. Without much thought, their fingers interlocked and the decision was made. There would be no more laughter, no more tears, only deep love from their hearts, and not even death would be able to separate them. Without a second of hesitation, they did what they decided. They stepped into the deep water while holding hands, allowing the river to drown them. Just as the two were about to sink into the water, an elderly man named Lu, who was hoeing nearby, noticed that something was wrong. Lu was terrified and dashed into the river to save them. The old man tried his best, but now the two of them were submerged. He fumbled in the river for a while before rescuing Xiao. Because he was too old, it took him a lot of effort to pull Xiao ashore. Now, when he looked back, he wanted to go into the water to save Li, but there was no sign of her in the river, as she had drifted with the current. Fortunately, Xiao choked on the water in his mouth and gradually awoke. But when he awoke, he saw that he was the only one saved. Li had vanished, and he ran into the river, desperately crying and wanted to be with Li. But the old man held him tight. Xiao cried bitterly as he looked at the rising river, saying clearly that they wanted to be together by choosing death, so why did they still have to be apart? At this point, Lu could only console Xiao with words before escorting him back home. After returning home, Xiao rushed to Li's house to inform the family of the news, and Li's parents and brother immediately ran to the river. Many people in the village came after hearing the news and gathered on the river bank.
"Li, my daughter!"
her mother cried. Li's father asked many people to assist him in getting into the river to retrieve the body, while her mother was kneeling on the ground and crying so hard that her heart was tearing. But after searching the river for a while, they couldn't find Li's body, and with no other way to find her, her father paid for a few small boats to travel further down the river. Folklore held that the drowned person would float on his own. If not, because the majority of them are entangled in the water ferns, people were still looking for Li's body down the water. Her mother was sitting on the bank beating her chest and crying to death. She said that she regretted and shouldn't have opposed this marriage. She forced her daughter into this path. But there was no medicine to heal regret in this world, and no matter how much she cried, Li could not be revived.
"It's my fault. Li, I hurt you."
From 2 o'clock in the afternoon until more than 7 o'clock in the evening, the body of Li wasn't found. Her family had paid to search for 3 days, but the body could not be found, which devastated Li's father and mother. Her mother couldn't handle the shock of her daughter's death and collapsed in bed, while her father scowled. That night, their family gathered to talk about how to resolve it. It was fine if nobody talked about her loss, but whenever Li was mentioned, the old woman's tears welled up in her eyes, beating her chest with regret. Her father was smoking a lot with a sad face all the time. The daughter was born from their guts, but now she was lying cold in the deep water, breaking their hearts. Li's brother stated that there was something wrong with the situation and suggested looking for a shaman to see if it could be resolved. The couple agreed with the idea. There was no other option. They could only try. 2 men arrived in Xiaoping village and looked for Mr. Shen's house. When a woman opened the door, Li's father said, "We came to meet Mr. Shen." The woman said nothing and turned around to let them into the yard. She brought the two of them into the room, opened the door, and informed people in the room that someone had come for business. At this point, they looked at the old blind man sitting in the room with a white beard. He greeted them. Li's father placed the items he had brought on the table. Li's father sat down, eager to find a body, but because he couldn't, he told Shen what had happened. When the old man Shen heard this, he sighed and said that Li was very resentful. When Li's father heard what Mr. Shen said, It was clear that Mr. Shen would have known something. He begged Mr. Shen to show him the way, and Mr. Shen replied that Li wanted to get married. Li's father was surprised to hear about the marriage and the afterlife. Shen gave the father detailed instructions on how to organize a wedding for the dead so that her body could be found. Finally, Mr. Shen emphasized that the ideal Yin marriage partner would be someone who wished to die in love with his daughter. Li's father was concerned after leaving his house. The relationship between the two families was strained in the past, but now he had to find someone who was compatible with this Yin and Yang marriage. Although his heart was troubled, Li's father had to grit his teeth and endure knocking on Zhao's door in order for his daughter to rest in peace as soon as possible. When Zhao's father opened the door and saw Li's father and brother, he was taken aback because two families had long since lost contact. Li's father was not pleased when he saw Zhao's face. His daughter was no longer with him, but their son was fine. First, Li's father claimed that his family was to blame and that he should not have stopped the children from falling in love. But when Zhao's father learned that he wanted his son to marry the dead girl, he became enraged. With that, Zhao's father violently shut the door, not allowing Li's father to speak another word. Despite being mentally prepared when he arrived, Li's father was still upset by Zhao's father's attitude. At this point, his son persuaded him to go back to find another solution. He sighed and turned home with his son. At this point, they heard the door to Zhao's house open. Zhao was the one who opened the door, screamed with emotion, and declared his intention to marry Li. Because Zhao's parents were powerless to stop their son, the two families arranged a yin-yang marriage, a belated wedding, yin and yang separation. That night, both sides of the family prepared all of the offering and the heartbreaking black and white Li's portrait. Zhao was also well dressed. The two had often fantasized about getting married, but no one imagined that they would have to marry under such ironic circumstances. Li's father purchased a rooster in accordance with Mr. Shen's instructions. Zhao hugged the chicken to his lap and bowed his head in front of Li's portrait. The long-awaited marriage of two young people had finally begun. According to the blind old man Shen, Zhao bit his right hand and dripped blood on the rooster's head. Mr. Shen said that the rooster would replace Zhao to go to find Li. Li's parents then placed the rooster in a cage and transported it to the river where Li committed suicide. Li's mother hugged the cage, choking with tears. If they hadn't stopped the children, they wouldn't have done these stupid things. Li's mother threw the cage into the river, extremely regretful. After a while, the water began to bubble up, as if something was about to rise. Then, Li's body came to the surface. Li's face was still fresh after days of being submerged in water, and the long-awaited wedding finally took place. Li was Zhao's wife after this marriage. Zhao insisted on burying Li in his family's ancestral grave, despite his parents' objections. Zhao would never give up on this love, and he wouldn't marry until getting old. He told his family that he only had one wife in this life, Li, and that if he died, they should bury him with Li. This story was a true story that happened in my village when I was only a 10-year-old boy. Although I was young at the time, I still remembered every detail in the story. If I was asked who was the most unhappy person in the village at that time, it would have to be Miss Nan. Nan's husband died early and her son was incompetent and useless. He was almost 30 years old, but all day he only knew how to drink, gamble and never do business. An elderly mother was 60 years old but still had to work hard to provide for her son. Her son not only didn't take care of her, but also when it came to meals and sleep, Ben still had to let his mother remind him. Every morning, Nan had to call her son until he would get out of bed. Because she had to repay Ben's, their already poor family was now even needier. A meal of porridge with dumplings was too luxurious for her mother. However, Benz could not be happy to see this meager meal. He went out despite his mother's call. The old mother always convinced him to take the right path and do good deeds, but Benz always ignored that advice. There was only one son in the family, but Miss Nant couldn't ask for anything, so she had to take care of everything, big and small. Miss Nant's health was poor, her limbs were slow, so she worked from early morning until noon in the hot sun. Everyone in the village loved her, but they couldn't help much because everyone was poor. Many people advised Miss Nant to kick her son out into the street. He needed to be independent, but anyway, for her, Benz was also the only child that she loved very much. At this time, the villager had just turned away when suddenly heard a loud noise, looked back and saw Miss Nant fainted, lying on the ground. The neighbor asked people around to carry Miss Nant home, then go to the place where they often organized gambling to find Benz. This woman rushed in and informed Miss Nant's condition, but Benz didn't care that his mother was fainting. For him, gambling was the most important thing right now. Seeing Benz's attitude, the people playing cards with him were also angry. They quickly ended the game and sent this unfilial son home. He just lost money and was taught life by everyone, so he was angry. Benz stood up, slammed the table and turned away, not forgetting to curse the other people a few sentences. When he got home, he opened the door with an angry kick, not caring at all for his mother ailing. He immediately rushed to the bed and scolded Miss Nant for embarrassing him, then turned and left. The mother used her weak breath to call and ask Benz to cook some white porridge because she was hungry, but his cold footsteps did not stop. Completely ignoring the life and death of his old mother, he went to another place to play cards. At this time it started to rain heavily. Benz looked up at the sky and swore a few words. He always thought that God was not fair to him because he was reincarnated into such a poor family. He continued to curse and immerse in the rain to the gambling area. He thought that this was the only way he could get rich quickly and forget his misfortune. By the time Benz got to the casino, there was already a muscular man waiting at the door. This man was a notorious debt collector in the village, once in prison for murder. Like many other gamblers, Benz was also involved with loan sharks. It seemed that Benz still didn't know the identity of this debt collector, so he ignored the man. The debt collector immediately blocked Benz. Just a small impact from the burly man made Benz tremble with fear. The debt collector pushed Benz out the door and warned him that if Benz didn't pay all the money, he wouldn't step foot in the casino. It seemed this debt collector had more humanity than Benz. The man also felt sorry for Benz's old mother, time and time again having to bear the debt for her children. Although Benz didn't want to go home, he didn't dare to attack. He knew that if he provoked the thug, he would only bring disaster on himself. Then he ran to another casino, but still no one let him in because everyone knew he had no money to play. By this time Benz was drenched like a rat. He was cold and hungry. Only now did he think about going home because there was no place to hold him. The rain was getting heavier and heavier. Thunder and lightning flashed continuously like the sky was angry with what Benz caused. Seeing the violent thunder, he also had a bad premonition. The whole person started to shake. Benz was scared, turned around and ran home as fast as possible. But he didn't run long enough before he was struck by thunder. He felt like an electric current ran through his body. Everything seemed blurry. He screamed in pain and fell to the ground. The screams of the sky mixed with the sound of rain made the atmosphere more mournful and deadly. His entire back was badly burned due to lightning strikes. Indeed, even God could not forgive an unfilial person like him. Accidentally, 2 villagers passed by and took him to the hospital. After knowing that, no one pitied him. The people in the village thought that this was the price he had to pay for his unfilial piety. The incident that the infilial Benz was struck by lightning spread throughout the village. Adults and children all ran to the hospital to see. At this moment he was screaming in agony because of the burn on his back, dragging his feet step by step to follow the other 2 kind people into the operating room. It seemed that God still left him a lifeline so he could correct his mistakes and take care of his old mother. The main character of the story was Anton, a dealer who went to the mountain alone that year to import medicinal herbs. He arrived in Damgon village, which was located deep in the mountains and had extremely inconvenient traffic. This was a location that produced high quality medicinal herbs, but due to transportation issues, very few people came to pick up the goods. As a result, the price of medicinal herbs was quite low here, and it met Anton's criteria. The people here were very welcoming, and when Anton arrived from elsewhere to buy medicinal herbs, the village chief immediately exhorted the people in the village to arrange for him to stay. It only took them a few minutes to find an empty house in the village for Anton to rest. Not only that, the villager chief also requested that his wife prepared a lavish dinner for him. The village chief then quickly left. When he arrived at the gate, he abruptly turned his head and told Anton not to go out at night. The village chief's statement piqued everyone's interest. Anton, on the other hand, didn't think much of it, quickly packing his bags and eating dinner. After a long day, Anton dozed off as soon as he sat down on the bed. The countryside, particularly in the mountains, had a very quiet atmosphere. The cool breeze also caused Anton to fall asleep gradually. He had no idea that something horrible was about to happen to him. At exactly midnight, a woman's pitiful cry could be heard from outside, and that sound jolted Anton awake. Despite the low volume, the cry created a sense of anxiety and insecurity in the listener. Anton stood up and wanted to go outside to see what was going on. The crying could clearly be heard coming from the courtyard, but when Anton went outside, there was no one there and the crying ceased. He was about to return to the house to sleep when he heard another cry from the back of the house. The cry was sad, but also spooky and strange. After going around the house, Anton came to a halt in front of the yard's corner, where a well was located. At the time, there was a woman crying on the edge of the well. Anton couldn't see the woman's face clearly because it was dark and she had her back turned, but her crying was heartbreaking. Anton, moved by pity, approached slowly to inquire about her story and console the poor girl. However, Anton was taken aback when he placed his hand on the woman's shoulder because the woman's body was extremely cold. The woman turned her head with a ghostly smile before Anton could react. Her face was haggard and pale, and her eyes were deep, and she didn't appear to be a regular person. Anton was afraid to scream loudly, so he turned to flee, but the woman caught him by the wrist. Due to the ghost's control, Anton was so terrified that his face turned pale and he felt a sharp pain in his wrist, the ghost's hand hooking into his skin. Anton jumped up, realizing it was all a dream. As a result of the intense pain, his face was still filled with fear at this point. Anton tried to remain calm and reassure himself that this nightmare could have been caused by being overtired. At the same time, Anton felt a sharp pain in his wrist, looked up, and saw 5 black fingerprints. In the dream, he was also grabbed by the witch's arm. However, when Anton looked around, he was astounded to see that the door was open and that some footprints stretched from the bed to the floor. Convinced that there was a thief in the house, Anton quickly glanced at the money bag next to him, which remained in the same position without moving. So who left a trace? Despite his fear, Anton was still curious about this to find out what had happened. He followed the trail of black footprints. As he walked behind the house, a gloomy atmosphere began to emerge. Anton's heart began to have a bad premonition as well. There was a well in front of Anton now, just like in a dream, except there was no ghost sitting on the well's wall and no ghostly cry. Anton had a feeling what he had just witnessed was more than a nightmare. Everything had to be related to the well in front of him. So Anton summoned his courage to walk towards the well, then placed his hand on the well wall and crawled inside to investigate. Anton saw nothing but dense water at the bottom of the well. The water surface, on the other hand, was constantly rippled as if something was about to happen. Just as Anton was about to return inside, a figure in the water appeared out of nowhere. If you looked closely, you could see that it was a woman's silhouette. When he saw the terrible scene in front of him, Anton's face darkened instantly. He screamed in fear and then backed away slowly due to inertia. When he stayed back, he ran into someone, quickly turned around, and Anton recognized the person was the village chief. The village chief's appearance at this moment was like Anton's savior. Anton hurriedly informed the village chief of his dream of a ghost and followed her in their footsteps to the strange well. Anton was then reassured by the village chief and led into the house. The chief began to tell him a story after he had calmed down. 7 years ago, a merchant who purchased medicinal herbs came to the village and was warmly welcomed. He was able to purchase medicinal herbs from the villagers at a reasonable price. However, after he left, everyone discovered that the money they had received was all counterfeit. Pam was one of the people who sold him medicinal herbs. He didn't want to be screwed after 2 years of hard work collecting herbs, so he went to the merchant's house to get his money back. However, 3 years had passed and Pam had not returned. When the villagers learned that he had died in a foreign land, Pam's wife couldn't take it any longer and jumped into the well to commit suicide. When the village chief finished telling the story, Anton felt a pang of sympathy, but no less fear. So the woman he met in his dream had to be Pam's wife. Suddenly, the village chief pulled a wooden stick from his belt, and a few villagers with knives and sticks burst in through the door, asking Anton to let them check his bag. Anton immediately refused, but the villagers eventually subdued him. A villager handed over his money bag to the village chief. When the village chief and some young men took the money from Anton's bag, they discovered it was all counterfeit. When his deception was exposed, Anton began to cry, pleading with the villagers to spare him. Of course, the villagers were unconcerned by his words. They despised scammers because of what happened to them 7 years ago. The village chief was the most enraged because he was Pam's father. He swung his wooden stick angrily at Anton, imagining his son being murdered by scammers. Anton was hit in the head with a stick before he could react. The stick immediately struck his head, splattering blood everywhere. In fear, Anton begged the village chief, but he was now completely transformed into a different person. He approached Anton slowly by an enraged expression. It appeared that the village chief was attempting to avenge his son by killing all of the scammers. He raised his stick again and struck Anton hard on the head. After being knocked unconscious, Anton was ruthlessly thrown off the cliff by the villagers. Anton miraculously avoided death. He then reported the incident to the police and was sentenced to prison for using counterfeit money. Those people who were with murder plots in Damgon village were also punished by law. It was the story I heard from Lao Lu in the village. He worked on the construction site. He cleaned the construction site during the day and helped look after it at night to avoid stealing steel and cement. That time, Lao Lu followed the team of engineers to repair the bridge in the evening. Lao Lu set up a tent and slept on the unfinished bridge. On weekdays, he ate dinner, drank tea and listened to the radio because he alone had no other pastimes. At 8 o'clock in the evening, he went out to inspect the construction site one more time before going to bed afterward. He turned off the radio, lit his flashlight and went out to check. The bridge was only half repaired, no one crossed. On the construction site, there was also someone's sand and tools piled up, nothing too valuable. Lao Lu looked at the front and back with his flashlight. When he saw nothing happened, he thought everything was probably fine. He returned to the tent and prepared to go to sleep. but when he opened the tent door, he heard a woman crying behind him. Lao Lu wondered if he had gone to check and found no one. So why were there women crying? He looked in the direction of the sound to check. He discovered something very shocking. As mentioned before, the bridge has not been repaired yet. Only half of it has been repaired. There were still some bridge piers on the river that had not been connected to the bridge body, but at this time Lao Lu saw a woman crying on the middle bridge pier in the river. At first Lao Lu was also taken aback. After that he calmed himself for a moment. Then he looked at it with a flashlight and wanted to ask this woman how to get to the pier. But he was surprised when he used the flashlight. The woman on the bridge suddenly disappeared and the crying stopped. Lao Lu thought that maybe he had seen the wrong thing with these blurry eyes, so he turned off the flashlight and went back to the tent. The next day, while everyone was having lunch, Lao Lu told the story of last night to the workers. He started telling the story and everyone was listening attentively. As soon as Lao Lu mentioned a bizarre story last night, the workers gathered a lot and asked him what he had seen. Lao Lu vividly recounted how he saw a woman crying on the jetty. Lao Lu pointed everyone to the pier that was lying there. This river was deep. It was difficult for ordinary people to climb up to the jetty in the middle of the river. The workers felt that Lao Lu's words were absurd. Lao Lu, a construction guard, was alone at night on the construction site and saw a mysterious person. Or did Lao Lu meet a ghost? Some people didn't believe it, and some people thought that Lao Lu didn't seem to be lying. Then they all remembered the previous shipwreck in the river. It turned out that a few days ago a boat upstream they were under construction sank, killing 2 men and a woman. The 2 men's bodies were recovered, but the woman's body had not been found. Someone asked if Lao Lu had to see the ghost of the drowning woman. Although Lao Lu's description of the woman sounded similar to the victim, some people still thought that there was no ghost at all. The story went on like that all day. In the evening, Lao Lu inspected the construction site as usual and did not hear the woman's cry anymore, so he returned to the tent and fell asleep. But in the middle of the night while Lao Lu was sleeping, that crying came again, sounding lamentable and sad. In the stillness of the night he heard very clearly Lao Lu sitting up, groaning. He dressed quickly and took a flashlight out of the tent. He wanted to find out if he was dizzy. He followed that sound to go to the bridge. The night scene was scary and creepy. From a distance, Lao Lu saw a woman sitting on the opposite jetty, crying there, very distressed. Lao Lu gathered his courage and shouted at the woman he did not understand what he was doing. As a result, the woman jumped off the pier. This thing was strange. This thing scared Lao Lu. He wanted to rush to save people, but he was too far from the pier. He stood dumbfounded as he shone his flashlight on the pier opposite his eyes. The woman disappeared halfway after the jump, and there was no sound after falling into the water. Lao Lu used the flashlight to shine on the pier many times, but the woman was nowhere to be seen. At this time, Lao Lu believed that the woman was a female ghost. Early the following morning, Lao Lu found Master Li, the contractor, and told him about seeing a female ghost. Boss Li was not happy to hear that. He thought Lao Lu was spreading superstition and spreading false rumors. Boss Li also said that if this affected workers' work, he would dismiss Lao Lu. Master Li scolded Lao Lu a few times and then left angrily. Ignoring Master Li, Lao Lu bought some underworld banknotes and burned them on the bridge after dark. It was that if you dreamed of a dead person, it was a bad omen. In such a case, you could burn some underworld banknotes. Lao Lu burned paper money for the female ghost on the bridge. It seemed to have really worked since that night. Lao Lu had not heard the crying for 3 days in a row, nor seen the female ghost again. On the 4th day, the workers began to pour the piers. At that time, the facilities were still poor. There were not many types of artificial machines like today. Workers poured the first layer of concrete and then waited for it to dry before pouring the next layer. The strange thing was that the bridge pier poured the day before. The next day it collapsed, so it could not be repaired for several days. The foreman couldn't help but report the strange incident to Boss Li. Boss Lee suspected that the foreman had cut down on the materials, which was why this happened. The foreman was so scared that he swore he would never do such a thing. Boss Lee believed that the foreman said, but the pier still couldn't continue pouring concrete. Was it really haunted? When Boss Lee heard the word ghost, he reminded the foreman. Boss Lee didn't say a word, but he thought about something in his heart. First, he reprimanded Lao Lu for engaging in superstition, which was actually just to let the workers work in peace. Then he stopped the project for a day. The following morning, a small car ran up the bridge. Boss Lee especially invited Master Zhang to help him see the date and calculate feng shui. Boss Lee led Master Zhang to the bridgehead and showed Master Zhang the pier where the accident happened. Master Zhang looked at the pier and his expression changed. Master Zhang said as soon as he arrived at the pier, he felt overwhelmed with gloom. Master Chung said that the bridge might be entangled in some resentment, so it had been built many times without success. When Boss Lee heard about it, he panicked and prayed to his master for a way to solve the problem. Master Zhang asked Boss Lee if anyone had died during the construction of the pier, because he felt that there was a contractor with a dark heart. When a worker had an accident, he directly buried the victim's body with reinforced concrete. Boss Lee swore that there was absolutely none and that he would not work so unscrupulously for the money. Master Zhang looked at Boss Lee and felt that he was not lying. Master Chung looked at the piers and said that the problem should lie in the water. Boss Lee hurriedly hired a good diver nicknamed the Water Rat, and at the same time found another boat and told the diver to go under the pier to check what was wrong. Lao Lu also joined the crowd, curiously waiting for the results. The diver rowed the boat out and under the pier alone. Everyone on the shore was also looking down. After taking a deep breath, the diver dived straight into the water. The sinking part of the pier was 5 or 6 meters deep, and the diver tried his best to dive. But under the pier he saw nothing but some gravel. He dived to the other side of the pier again, trying to see if there was anything unusual on the other side. But as soon as he dived, he was so scared that he choked on the water. He saw that some of the rocks under the bridge were cement blocks with many exposed steel bars. A woman's body was hooked by steel rods and hung there. The body swayed continuously in the water. The diver quickly surfaced, shouting to Boss Lee on the shore that there was a female body under the pier. Boss Lee selected 2 more diving workers from among the workers and promised to pay more to bring the woman's body ashore with the diver. Lao Lu also followed Boss Lee to see how things were going. The woman's body, despite being soaked in water for many days, still did not rot and swell but was soggy white with a lamentable expression. Master Zhang thought that woman didn't want to die, so her face was full of resentment. After being compared by the police, the female lead's body was the one who was not found in the shipwreck a few days ago. Boss Lee also spent a lot of money to let Master Zhang perform the magic. Finally, the bridge was completed and had been in use for many years. After hearing Lao Lu's story, I even went to see it. It was just that the symbols on the jetty have long since disappeared and were no longer visible. It occurred in 2013 while I was a student. There is a fairly clear river right next to the hostel where we live. We're all from the country and we've been swimming in rivers since we were kids, so when we saw this one, we knew we had to jump in. Aniko quickly undressed and began wading into the water. This individual appears to be looking forward to revisiting his childhood memories. Kane and I both went into the water shortly after. The river in the city isn't as clear and cool as the river in the country, but it still makes us happy. We swam for a while before starting to play in the water like we did in the country. If anyone happened to pass by, they'd probably think we had some kind of mental illness. There is a bridge near the river. Although bathing near the bridge would have been cooler, we never went because there was an underground current under the bridge that was dangerous. That day, I noticed someone swimming beneath the bridge. Aniko approached, intrigued by my surprised expression, and inquired as to what I was looking at. I stated that I saw someone swimming beneath the bridge. That area is extremely dangerous. If you slip, you could lose your life. After hearing this, Aniko and Kane became concerned as well, so the three of them looked at the water beneath the bridge at the same time. After a long period of observation, we determined that it was a girl. She, on the other hand, remained stationary and did not move. I couldn't see her face because it was so dark under the bridge. All I could see was her long hair floating in the water. Because Aniko and Kane suspected I was spying on the girl, they urged me to come over and strike up a conversation. I have a crush on a girl with long hair, but I can't talk to her naked. The three of us swam in the river until the sun went down before getting back. Before going back to the inn, I looked under the bridge to see if the long-haired girl was still there. For some reason, it was already getting dark, but she hasn't landed. However, I quickly left because I was afraid the girl would think I was sneaking around. Because the weather was still hot the next day, the three of us planned to go to the river to swim after school. Because it was extremely hot, I entered the water before Aniko this time. The two boys quickly dressed up and chased them down, but as soon as I stepped into the water, I noticed the long-haired girl I saw under the bridge the day before. Not only was I taken aback by the girl's appearance, but so were Aniko and Kane. This piqued everyone's interest. The long-haired girl from yesterday swam in only in one position and didn't even look back. Swim. But all three of us had the impression that the other girl was floating in the water. Aniko, who was always cheerful, began to be concerned. He didn't think this girl enjoyed swimming so much that she spent 2 days in the river. Kane also spoke up at this point. He had the impression that it was just a human head floating in the water. But Aniko and I both thought it was impossible because the water under the bridge was moving so quickly. If it had been a human head that couldn't stay put, it could have been swept away. After some deliberation, Kane came to the conclusion that it is best if we go under the bridge to find out what the truth is. Aniko and I both agreed on this point, so we made the decision to approach the other girl. Because I was the best swimmer of the three of us, I led the way to the fast water just to be safe. I couldn't see her face very well because it was quite dark under the bridge. All I could see was her very long hair and snow-white skin. I was afraid to approach her for fear of upsetting her. I only dared to stand back and try to call and ask from some distance. She did not respond, but instead slowly turned her head to follow the flowing water, and what happened right after that was truly terrifying. What we've seen since yesterday is a human head, and it's starting to decompose. Maggots are crawling from the eye sockets, nose and mouth. I screamed in terror and backed away slowly. Aniko and Kane, who were swimming alongside, were both terrified. We three panicked and swam ashore, where we immediately called the police, who arrived to investigate the incident. It turned out that the head was tied to a large rock, which prevented it from moving at all. We were returned from some interrogation as a group of 3. Aniko, Kane and I skipped dinner that night, unable to swallow the maggots crawling all over the girl's face. Perhaps because we were too shocked and tired to sleep that night, we all went to bed early, but the fear on our faces could not be hidden. That night, Kane and Aniko both had the same strange dream. This appears to be what the other girl was attempting to convey to us. We fantasized about the river road. It was evening and a girl with long hair was riding a bicycle. Suddenly, a dark figure leapt from the shore's grass and charged towards her. The girl screamed in terror, but no one heard her. To avoid everyone's gaze, the shadow pushed the long-haired girl and a bicycle into the grass. He used his hand to strangle the girl until the girl could no longer resist. I don't know what his purpose is to act like that. After killing the girl, the man tied her up and placed her body on the back of the bicycle. He then walked towards a water tower by the river, wondering what this perverted murderer was going to do with the poor girl's body. Looks like this isn't the first time he's killed someone. He calmly carried the girl's body to the top of the water tower. Then he put the girl down and stared at her body like he was contemplating his booty. After observing for a while, he bent down to pick up a large rock from the ground. Involuntarily, a mysterious smile appeared on his face. With an amused expression on his face, he used all of his strength to repeatedly throw the large stone at the girl's body. After the girl was dead, he broke her neck, severed her head, and placed her head in a black bag. He looked down at the river and chose the section with the fastest current. He then dumped the poor girl's head into the water. He tied the head with a large stone to prevent it from floating away. In the dream, I appeared to have transformed into that girl, and I felt myself falling into a stream of cold water. Through the water, I could even see the man's evil face. After committing so many sinful acts, he smiled contentedly. I tried to wake up because that dream was causing me so much pain as if I were a victim for myself. Everyone was drenched in sweat from the fear by this point. As soon as I opened my eyes, I noticed a swarm of maggots on my pillow. They confused me as to whether this was real or a dream. I immediately jumped up, panicked and howled because I was disgusted and nauseated. At this point, I realized that I was not the only one who had been awakened in this manner. Both Aniko and Kane are wearing the same expressions as me. Not only that, but the floor of the hostel is now full of water, much like the scene in my hometown on heavy rainy days. But this is the 7th floor of the dormitory. It was hard to believe. There are still long hairs floating on the floor's water, and we have no idea where they came from. I was curious, so I asked Aniko and Kane why they had gotten up so early. Their response made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. They wished for a girl like me. We've all had the same dream. The more I thought about it, the more terrified I became. So we went to the police station together and tracked down the officer who had questioned us that day. He didn't believe what we were saying, but luckily this cop was still in charge of the case. So he drove us down the river to see if he could locate the water tower we were discussing. There was indeed a water tower by the river, not far from where we used to swim. These water towers appear to have been abandoned for a long time. They are quite old, with many cracks on the outside. We drove past 3 water towers in a row, but none of them resembled the ones we saw in our dreams. The cop was getting frustrated because we couldn't figure out which tower it was, so he offered to drive us home. I, Kane and Aniko were all perplexed, but I still believe it's not a coincidence that all 3 of us had the same dream. Just as we were about to give up, Kane, who was sitting in the back seat, yelled and pointed out the window. When we looked in the direction he indicated, we found a ruined water tower just like in our dreams. So the cop and the 3 of us approached the water tower to observe, hoping to find clues to the case. The volunteer cop led the way with the 3 of us trailing behind. Strange things happened in quick succession, and we gradually lost our courage. As we got closer to the water tower, a strong stench rose up, making everyone want to vomit. The cop asked us to wait below while he climbed alone to inspect the top of the water tower. A headless girl's body was found above the water tower. Then, a large number of police and forensic officers arrived. I had an indescribable feeling when we were back in the police car, looking at the poor girl's body being brought down from the water tower. Although this incident was reported in the newspaper, we have always kept this strange dream a secret.